Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a cold, hard look at one of the strangest and most unsettling criminal cases in recent American history, the Kraus confession. And the core idea here, the thing that is just chilling to its bones, is this terrible secret held not for weeks or months, but for 8 long, silent years.
8 years.
And that secret was buried literally, physically, in the quiet, unassuming backyard of a suburban home on Crestwood Court in Albany, New York.
That's absolutely the right place to start. And our mission today is, it's complex. We are examining this case as a chilling study in contrasts.
Also,
The contrast between the tedious, the routine of suburban life and the unspeakable act it concealed. And then there's the contrast between a son's self-proclaimed duty of caregiving and the profound darkness of a double homicide.
and what's so wild about this story is how that whole 8-year deception, which was this meticulously crafted illusion, was ultimately undone.
Right. It wasn't unraveled by a traditional witness or a sudden guilty conscience breaking through. No, it was triggered by, of all things, a cold, hard, bureaucratic failure point.
The bureaucratic trigger.
Yeah.
That set off a chain of events that, it moved with surprising speed, culminating in September of 2025 in just a surreal, ethically fraught, half-hour television confession.
A moment that immediately redefined the role of media in criminal justice, for better or worse.
So for our source material for this deep dive, we're focusing pretty intensely on police records, neighbor testimonies, the financial documents, and of course the media reports surrounding the disappearance of Franz and Theresia Kraus way back in 2017.
We're basically tracing the path from the moment their remains are discovered through that extraordinary public admission by their son, Lorenz Kraus, and then into the legal chaos that, that immediately followed.
So if you, the learner, are joining us, your shortcut takeaway for this deep dive is going to be incredibly pointed. This story, it serves as a devastating real-world instruction manual on 2 key points. Firstly, how often the most meticulous crimes fail, not because of some brilliant detective work, but because of small, unnoticed financial irregularities that eventually trigger an automated government system.
The machine catches them. And the second point.
And secondly, how a perpetrator who operates under this grandiose, self-justifying narrative will often choose to seek the very public spotlight, the fame, the validation that ultimately ensures their immediate capture and imprisonment.
It's the journey from the mundane to the monstrous. And to get there, we have to understand the foundation of the lie first.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We have to start where it all began, in that quiet house on Crestwood Court, and the carefully constructed illusion that Lorenz Kraus successfully maintained for nearly a decade.
Let's do it.
To truly grasp the tragedy of this case, we need to begin with Franz and Theresia Kraus themselves.
Yeah, the victims.
They weren't just elderly victims. They were immigrant parents, survivors of, unimaginable hardship. They had lived through World War II in Germany.
Think about that for a second. They survived one of the most destructive periods in human history. They navigated the trauma of post-war immigration, came to the United States, and built a decades-long life in that same Albany home.
By 2017, they were quite elderly. Franz was in his early 90s and Theresia was in her mid-80s.
Their life, understandably, had narrowed. Their world had become that house. And their primary connection to the outside and their full-time caregiver was their son, Lorenz Kraus.
Lorenz was in his mid-40s at the time. He lived with them, which, is a pretty common arrangement in many families, especially when elder care becomes necessary.
It is, and by all outward appearances, he was playing the part. Neighbors described him as unusual, maybe a bit isolated, perhaps reclusive.
But functional.
But undeniably functional in his role. He was the picture of the dutiful son.
And that persona, that dutiful son persona, was everything. It was his camouflage.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize how meticulously he performed these visible, high-impact domestic tasks. He's checking the mail every single day. He's mowing the lawn on a schedule. He's shoveling the snow during Albany's relentless winters.
It's not just basic maintenance, is it? It's a performance.
It is a performance. It's a stage setting that broadcasts a very clear message. Everything is normal here. I am coping. Nothing is wrong.
And that stage setting is exactly what allowed the double disappearance in the summer of 2017 to go completely unnoticed and critically unquestioned for so long. Franz and Theresia just doing. They simply stopped appearing around June of that year. And Lorenz, he had a story ready to go immediately, a narrative that was plausible enough to just ward off any casual curiosity.
And what was the story?
He told anyone who asked neighbors, local contacts, that his parents had moved back to Germany.
Let's just stop and analyze the genius of that lie for a moment.
It's disturbingly effective.
It wasn't some complex, fabricated story about a long vacation or a medical facility. It was the ultimate, believable farewell for this specific demographic.
Right, elderly immigrants returning to their homeland to live out their final years.
It's a common and, a bittersweet reality. It just sounds right. It doesn't raise any flags.
And it also highlights the profound isolation they were already experiencing. There wasn't a wide social network checking on them daily.
No, just a few neighbors who saw the son, the supposed caregiver, still keeping the routine. They trusted the dutiful son. They internalized that, well, if anyone knows what's going on, it's him.
And Lorenz went to, extraordinary lengths to maintain this curated illusion of normalcy. He didn't rush to sell the house, for instance.
Which would have attracted a lot of attention. Questions about power of attorney, deeds.
Exactly. Instead, he kept up the utilities, the tax payments, the maintenance. This constancy, this refusal to let the house fall into neglect, that was the most effective part of his camouflage.
But even the best camouflage can't hide everything. Not forever. Especially not when the lie lasts for 8 years.
Indeed. While the majority of the neighborhood just accepted the story, the facade, it had these subtle cracks. They were visible only to those who were, paying very close attention.
And our sources detail the observations of one particular long-term neighbor, a woman who lived directly next door between 2016 and 2021.
And she noticed things, things that individually maybe meant nothing, but when you compile them, they paint this picture of extreme control and paranoia.
What specifically did she see that stood out to her?
It was this insistence on control over his immediate environment. For instance, there was a major storm that summer that knocked down a tree.
Okay.
And when the work crews came, Lorenz paid for the damage and removal on the neighbor's side of the property line. But he insisted, rigidly insisted, that the workers should not, under any circumstances, touch his side of the property.
Wow. Okay, so if you're trying to cover up a fresh burial site.
Right. You want no heavy equipment, no non-family eyes, and definitely no digging anywhere near that specific area. This desperate need for control, even over something as routine as storm cleanup, it speaks volumes in hindsight.
It's a profound detail, and it links directly to the area of concealment.
And the same neighbor also noticed him discarding a large, unusual amount of trash over a short period. Not just household trash, but bulk items.
Clearing things out?
And then there was the most damning physical observation, the one that, really should have been an immediate red flag, but was rationalized away.
The backyard.
The state of the backyard. The neighbor noticed that the once neat grass in a particular area was gone. Just gone. It had been replaced by freshly turned dirt.
But she dismissed it.
She did. When she reflected on it later, she admitted she'd actually wrote it off as a potential garden project or some landscaping effort.
Yeah.
Your brain doesn't go there. You simply don't associate a quiet suburban backyard with a double gravesite.
It's the ultimate cognitive blind spot, isn't it? The small, constant maintenance, the lawn mowing, it reinforces the idea of normalcy, which makes the larger, more disturbing physical evidence so much easier to dismiss as benign.
But the neighbor, she admitted she struggled with this intense internal conflict over those years.
She articulated that psychological difficulty of reporting suspicion perfectly. She stated later to investigators, and this is a direct quote, "On one hand, I felt that he was psycho. On the other hand, I was thinking, how can a child kill the parents? It's just unbelievable."
That emotional chasm, the leap from he's odd to he's a murderer.
It's too vast for most people to cross without definitive proof. And that profound human reluctance, that inability to process the possibility of filial homicide, that served as Lorenz Kraus's primary defense mechanism for 8 solid years.
So if we connect this meticulous maintenance, the quiet lie about Germany, the refusal to attract any attention to the home, we arrive at the motive that provided the framework for the entire 8-year deception.
We're looking at a crime of convenience. That's what this is. It was fueled by financial greed, and it was disguised by this performance of supposed duty. The Krauses were not in Germany. They were buried right there.
And the concealment was purely instrumental.
Completely. It allowed Lorenz to maintain the status quo and, critically, to continue collecting their Social Security and likely other benefits. For 8 years, our sources allege, he diverted funds intended for the parents he had killed, effectively funding his life through a fraud that was rooted in double homicide. The deception was inseparable from the financial gain.
And here's where the narrative pivots, where the meticulous, almost perfect deception of the quiet suburban home finally cracks.
And it's not because of human emotion.
No, it's because of data. The facade crumbled not through a witness finally making that difficult emotional leap, but through the cold, hard, automated logic of a government system.
That's the extraordinary twist in all this. The trigger wasn't a cop on the beat or a suspicious neighbor finally calling it in. It was the Social Security Administration, one of the largest bureaucratic machines in the world.
This all happened in the spring of 2025. What happened specifically? How did the SA flag this?
Well, the SSA has these automated systems. They're designed to monitor the status of recipients, especially the elderly, to prevent fraud and ensure proper disbursement. It's a massive data crunching operation.
So what kind of irregularity were they seeing? We're talking about an algorithmic flag, right? Not a person.
Exactly. For beneficiaries of a certain age, especially those receiving direct deposit payments, the SSA periodically needs confirmation of life. This can be through life certificates, check-ins, or cross-referencing death records.
And in this case?
In this case, benefits for Franz, who would have been 92, and Theresia, 83, were still being actively drawn and deposited into a joint or linked account. But the agency had lost all direct, verifiable contact with them over a significant period.
So the system saw continued financial activity coupled with an alarming lack of, a life sign verification.
Precisely, which is a classic indicator of potential fraud. The system basically works as this unintended alarm bell. So in May of 2025, this irregularity triggered a standard welfare check request.
And that gets dispatched to the local police.
To the Albany Police Department. And you have to understand, they weren't looking for bodies yet. They were just looking for evidence that 2 elderly people were alive and well and receiving their entitled benefits.
And even at that point, with police at his door, Lorenz Kraus maintained his original 8-year-old story.
He stuck to it. He told the officers that his parents were living in Germany. But this is where the investigation differed from a casual neighbor inquiry.
Because the police had data.
They had the financial data back in their requests. They weren't just relying on neighborhood gossip. They knew money was moving and that the recipients themselves were totally non-responsive.
So his evasiveness, combined with the hard data on the continued benefits deposits,
it immediately prompted the authorities to escalate the matter. They quickly shifted the primary focus from a simple wellness check to a formal financial crimes investigation.
So they were building a paper trail, a case for fraud, theft, and malfeasance. The working theory at this point is that Lorenz is stealing from his parents, but they haven't yet concluded the parents are dead.
Yes, and that financial trail was absolutely crucial because it provided the probable cause necessary to overcome the constitutional barrier to search the property. You can't just go digging in someone's yard.
You need a warrant.
You need a warrant. So the investigation built methodically from May through September of 2025. By late September, they had sufficient evidence of financial malfeasance and, concealment to obtain that search warrant for the Crestwood Court property.
And the scene on that quiet suburban street, it must have changed drastically that week. It went from the picture of meticulous normalcy to a major crime scene.
Oh, absolutely. On Tuesday, September 23rd, Albany police descended on Crestwood Court. And their attention, informed by the timeline of the disappearance and maybe some historical input about the strange backyard activity mentioned in early interviews.
They went right for the backyard.
They focused immediately on that soft, disturbed ground in the backyard. The small detail the neighbor had dismissed 8 years earlier was now the absolute center of a homicide investigation.
And the discovery was horrifyingly swift once they started digging.
Yeah. On Wednesday, September 24th, the excavation began, and the first set of human remains was recovered. The very next morning, Thursday, September 25th, the second body was found.
And the source material notes they were found in close proximity.
Yes, confirming the scope of the crime as a double homicide from the outset.
So this immediately escalates the situation from a financial fraud case to a capital crime. Albany Police Chief Brendan Cox held a press conference later that morning.
Right. And the chief announced to the public and the media that they were confident the remains belonged to Franz and Theresia Kraus and that they had officially launched a double homicide investigation. He's informing the world of the grim discovery and the suspected nature of the crime.
And here's the element of, it's cinematic, almost impossible timing that elevates this case beyond standard crime reporting. As Police Chief Cox's press conference was literally concluding, announcing the grim find and the murder investigation to the cameras, the alleged killer was already in motion. He was preparing for a very different kind of reveal.
The police chief announced the discovery of the bodies, But Lorenz Kraus had decided he was going to announce the grim, intimate truth of their end. He was choosing the stage for his own self-justification.
The lead up to this public confession reveals a calculated, almost performance-driven move by Kraus. He knows the police are digging in his backyard. He knows the lie is over.
So he makes two concurrent and synchronized moves. And they're designed to control the narrative.
What were they?
First, he called the local CBS affiliate, WRGB, and at the exact same time, he emailed a 2-page, rambling political and personal statement to multiple news outlets.
And crucially,
He included his phone number. He wanted to be found, but he wanted to be heard first, on his own terms.
Stone Grissom, who was WRGB's news director, was the one who initially engaged him. When Grissom called that number back, Kraus admitted he had buried his parents, but demonstrating this sort of partial and distorted understanding of his legal rights, he immediately invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked if he killed them.
So he was willing to be a showman, but he wanted to set the terms of the performance. I'll tell you this much, but not that much.
Exactly. And the network, they're faced with an ethical crisis in real time. They have the person of interest who admits to burial, but is claiming his right against self-incrimination regarding the murder itself.
And this is where the deal was struck, a deeply controversial one that will echo through the courts. Grissom offered an interview, and in exchange, the station would post Kraus's 2-page statement online.
And Kraus agreed.
He agreed and arrived at the Schenectady studio within the hour.
It's genuinely stunning to picture that sequence. The police are recovering, remains a few miles away, and the suspect just walks into a television studio parking lot, willingly seeking the media spotlight.
And the anchor, Greg Floyd, a veteran journalist, he had only 10 minutes to prepare for what would become the most extraordinary, ethically ambiguous interview of his career.
He's faced with this massive challenge. Get the truth from a man who is already invoking the Fifth, but do it without crossing the line to coercion, which would later invalidate the entire confession.
A legal minefield?
Yeah. And the interview started tense. Kraus was initially hesitant, evasive, and he reiterated his refusal to discuss the cause of death. He confirmed he buried them, but when Floyd pressed him directly on how they died, he once again invoked the Fifth Amendment.
This is the crucial moment. The lawyer he didn't have was screaming the correct legal advice in his head, but his own grandiosity, his need to tell his story, it just eventually overwhelmed it.
And Floyd was persistent, which is where the legal questions later arise. For 8 minutes, it was this tense, adversarial exchange unfolding live on television.
And the anchor kept returning to the central question. He was focusing on the details of the decay, the smell, the state of the home. He was avoiding the abstract political tangents Kraus kept trying to inject. He kept it grounded in the physical reality of the crime.
And then the source material describes this breaking point, the moment the dam broke. Floyd moved past the evasiveness, and he made a direct assertion, probably based on the forensic evidence they suspected they'd find. He just says, you suffocated them. You suffocated your parents.
And Kraus, after a devastating pause that seemed to last forever on camera, replied with this casual, horrific confirmation.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, basically. And from that point on, the floodgates opened. And the details that emerged were just chilling in their intimacy and their claimed motivation.
He grew strangely calm. He started describing the specific horrible details of the murders, but it was all filtered entirely through his own distorted lens of duty.
He claimed his father, Franz, who was 92, was struggling profoundly after cataract surgery, and his mother, Theresia, 83, had been injured after a fall. He framed the situation as desperate, claiming they knew they were going downhill, and that he was just responding to their misery.
Then he described the method. He claimed he strangled his father, Franz, with his bare hands, and then he offered this detail that is uniquely heartbreaking and confusing. He said his mother, Theresia, put his father's head on his chest after Franz had died.
That detail is critical. If it's true, it suggests what? A profound final connection between the parents, or perhaps a moment where Theresia realized the horror of what was happening, or even in his self-serving view that she was somehow complicit in this tragic sequence.
But Kraus himself immediately negated any potential altruism when he followed up chillingly saying, and after a few hours I finished her.
He strangled his mother with a rope.
With a rope. And he admitted it took him several days to decide where and how to bury the bodies, revealing this period of cold, calculated decision-making after the homicides.
And the ultimate justification he offered was the linchpin of his entire worldview.
I did my duty to my parents. He asserted that his concern for their misery was paramount.
This is the ultimate profound exercise in cognitive dissonance. He's framing this double murder as a mercy killing, an act of selfless compassion.
Yet under questioning, he admitted that his parents never asked him to end their lives.
Never. He had unilaterally decided that he was the executor of their fate. This transforms the act from one of claimed compassion into one of profound control and, legally, malice.
But the interview didn't just stick to the crime. And this is where the true depths of Kraus's fractured psychological state were really revealed.
Right. Interspersed with the detailed description of violence were these bizarre, grandiose political tangents that just spoke to his underlying paranoia.
He spoke of a need to widen up the law, meaning essentially legalizing euthanasia in certain circumstances, to specifically help the 40 million baby boomers who he claimed were facing similar elder care issues.
So he wasn't just confessing, he was delivering a manifesto. He was trying to position himself as some kind of reluctant martyr and a necessary legal pioneer.
And the 2-page email statement he sent out, that provided even more evidence of his delusional state.
Yeah, the sources confirm it was just a chaotic mix of personal horror and extreme paranoid politics. It included rambling proposals to dissolve the current government and replace it with a board of trustees. It referenced incoherent conspiracy theories involving politicians, the deep state, and cryptocurrency.
This blend of intimate violence and political grandiosity, it suggests his crime wasn't just about financial fraud or even caregiver burnout. It was wrapped up in a larger, chaotic, delusional system.
He sought the spotlight not just to confess, but to ensure his personal narrative, the one where he was the dutiful, misunderstood hero, was broadcast to the world.
Well, the half-hour interview concluded. Lorenz Kraus walked out of the CBS 6 building and found that his bid for public validation ended abruptly and immediately.
Albany police officers were waiting right there in the parking lot.
He was arrested on the spot. The charges were swift. 2 counts of second-degree murder and 2 counts of concealment of a human corpse.
The confession was public, televised, and detailed. But the legal battle to determine if that confession was even admissible was just beginning.
The contrast is it's so stark. The day after that televised admission, Friday, September 26th, Lorenz Kraus stood in Albany City Court.
The entire country had just witnessed him detail his crimes.
Right. But through his court-appointed attorney, Assistant Albany County Public Defender Rebecca Sokol, he entered a plea of not guilty.
And this plea is the legal system asserting its integrity against the backdrop of this media spectacle. The fact that the entire world watched him confess means legally nothing if his constitutional rights were violated in the process.
So Rebecca Sokol immediately targeted the TV interview as the crucial first legal battleground.
She had to. In her public statement, she said, I'm quoting here, "While the interview from the other night was certainly shocking, I have to question how it occurred, who initiated it, and what the police's involvement was."
Her core assertion is a powerful legal maneuver. The defense is arguing that if a vulnerable individual's constitutional rights were violated for the sake of ratings, then the entire confession, no matter how truthful, must be suppressed. It must be deemed inadmissible.
Which places the veteran anchor, Greg Floyd, and his news director in a profoundly contested legal role.
This is the crux of the admissibility challenge, isn't it? Was Floyd a journalist seeking a scoop, protected by the First Amendment right to gather information?
Or had he essentially become an agent of police, conducting an interrogation on behalf of law enforcement without first providing Kraus his Miranda rights?
So what would the defense actually have to prove to establish that agent of police claim? That seems like a high bar.
It is a high bar. They would need to show explicit coordination. For example, that the police suggested the interview, or that they provided questions to Floyd, or that there was some kind of agreement to share the confession footage immediately in exchange for the network being allowed to air it first.
So just being arrested afterwards isn't enough to prove it.
No. But the defense will also argue the totality of the circumstances. You have Kraus, who invoked his Fifth Amendment right on camera before he broke down. The defense could argue that a man who shows clear signs of mental instability and paranoia, as evidenced by his own manifesto, is inherently vulnerable and highly susceptible to the pressure of a live television interrogation,
making his ultimate confession involuntary, regardless of police involvement.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Stone Grissom, the news director, he defended the broadcast. He argued they were purely seeking truth and that Kraus came to them willingly, that he sought them out specifically.
The station's position is that they were fulfilling a public service by broadcasting the truth as offered by the source.
But the judge is going to have to assess whether that exchange and interview in return for posting his manifesto constituted an inducement that crossed the line from journalism into unconstitutional coercion. It's a very fine line.
And while all this legal maneuvering begins, investigators were digging into Lorenz Kraus's personal history. And what they found, it provides essential context for the complex psychology behind his actions. He wasn't just a quiet, troubled son.
No, not at all. The forensic investigation revealed a documented history of profound extremist views, grandiosity, and paranoia dating back years. We found evidence that he actually ran on the 2020 New Hampshire presidential ballot as a Democrat.
Which is, in and of itself, an inherently strange and ambitious move for a man who claimed to be a full-time caregiver for his elderly parents.
And his platform was even more radical than his candidacy. He was advocating for the dissolution of the entire American presidency.
And this political ambition, it was deeply intertwined with a disturbing, conspiratorial, and fractured worldview.
It was. His campaign website utilized an anti-Semitic domain name and actively promoted classic conspiracy theories about the deep state and global control. This isn't just eccentricity. This is evidence of a deteriorating mind constructing a complex system of delusion.
So if we connect this history of paranoia, extremist politics, and grandiosity to the confession itself, it fundamentally alters the narrative of the crime.
It does. It moves from being a tragic, isolated incident of elder care failure into a calculated, horrific act that's woven into a larger delusional system of self-justification.
So his murder justification, that I did my duty,
Yeah.
it wasn't just an emotional excuse he came up with on the spot.
No, it was, in his mind, aligned with his political anti-government mission. If he believes the government and society are fundamentally broken, controlled by nefarious forces, then standard laws and morality cease to apply to him.
He believes he was acting on a higher, necessary mandate, maybe even saving his parents from a world he perceives as toxic or broken.
His grandiosity demanded a stage. He didn't flee. He sought the spotlight to broadcast this duty. And the psychological implications of that televised confession, they strongly suggest the acute cognitive dissonance we see in many complex criminal cases.
The calm, descriptive violence set against the rambling, chaotic political tangents.
He needed to transform himself. He wasn't a desperate fraudster worried about losing access to his parents' money. He was, in his own mind, a tragic hero, a self-appointed savior acting on a necessary, if violent, mandate. By confessing publicly, he tried to control the narrative to ensure that the context for his crime was his manifesto, not the financial investigation that actually led to his discovery. He chose the stage over the shadows.
This psychological complexity brings us right back to the trial's core conflict.
Yeah.
The legal definition of intent. Lorenz Kraus is claiming duty and mercy through his defense.
But that not guilty plea forces the state to prove criminal intent or malice beyond a reasonable doubt.
And malice is absolutely critical here. In New York law, second-degree murder requires intent to cause the death of another person.
Right. The defense will present this as an emotional, involuntary act of mercy committed in a moment of extreme duress. But the prosecution has a wealth of evidence that contradicts pure altruism.
The key counterargument has to be the period after the homicides.
Yes. The actions that followed, the calculated burial in the backyard, the 8-year deception, and the massive alleged theft of Social Security benefits, all stand as powerful evidence of calculation, greed, and self-preservation.
These actions suggest intent and planning, not a spontaneous, tragic act of mercy.
A spontaneous mercy killing would involve calling the police, an immediate admission, and no financial gain. Kraus waited days before burying the bodies and then systematically perpetuated a financial crime for nearly a decade. That financial motive introduces a clear, calculated element of malice that the defense's duty claim is going to struggle to overcome.
So the prosecution's case will rely on what we can define as 3 critical pillars that must hold up under legal scrutiny.
The first and the most controversial is the admissibility of that surreal televised confession.
If the confession is admitted, the case is virtually closed, regardless of the plea. The level of descriptive detail he provided aligns perfectly with the crime.
But if it's suppressed due to constitutional violations, that agent of police argument we talked about, the prosecution's path becomes much, much harder. They'd have to rely entirely on the other 2 pillars.
The second pillar being the forensic evidence. This involves the official identification of the remains, confirming they are Franz and Theresia, and the precise determination of the cause of death.
Which is challenging. After 8 years of burial, determining the exact cause of death, strangulation by hands versus strangulation by rope, is difficult. But it's absolutely necessary to corroborate Kraus's very specific, detailed description given on television.
So the physical evidence has to align with his narrative of violence.
It does. If the bodies show signs of decomposition that make the specific cause of death inconclusive, the prosecution will have to rely heavily on the confession, which loops us right back to Pillar 1 and its admissibility.
But if the evidence shows clear, specific strangulation marks that align with his description,
then it significantly strengthens the entire case, regardless of whether the confession gets in or not.
And the third, and arguably most foundational pillar, is the financial crimes probe.
Meticulously tracing the alleged theft and use of the parents' Social Security benefits over that full 8-year period. This financial trail provides the hard evidence of motive, the malice, that the defense is trying to obscure with that high-minded duty claim.
And we can't forget the importance of the circumstantial evidence of the concealment itself. We have to bring back the neighbor's testimony about the backyard.
The observant woman who noticed the freshly turned earth.
Right. Her memory, combined with the forensic discovery timeline and the fact that Kraus admitted to waiting days before burying them, it all reinforces the premeditation aspect necessary for a murder charge. It reinforces that this was not a desperate, spur-of-the-moment act of compassion.
So the trial will essentially be an attempt to peer into this psychological and legal abyss. Was this fundamentally a calculated crime of greed and convenience disguised as mercy? A man desperate to maintain his financial stability?
Or was it the tragic, violent endpoint of a genuinely deteriorating, paranoid mind that was convinced of its own horrific righteousness?
The human tragedy here is just immense. Franz and Theresia Kraus survived the horrors of a world war. They navigated displacement, rebuilt their lives in America, and achieved a measure of security. To think they met their terrible end at the hands of the son they raised.
And were then literally buried beneath the ground they owned, waiting 8 years for a bureaucratic error to bring the whole awful truth to light. It's a profound statement on isolation and hidden violence.
So if we connect this knowledge gained back to your world, this story, it really confronts several profoundly uncomfortable societal questions.
It does.
It forces us to think about the increasing isolation of the elderly, the immense and often unspoken burden of elder care, and the terrifying potential for extreme violence that can exist hidden within families.
It also highlights the disturbing truth that sometimes the cold external societal checks, like the SSA's automated system, can be the only functional alarm system we have left.
That's a scary thought.
It really hammers home the central thematic tension we've discussed. That line where care blurs profoundly into absolute control and where claimed compassion morphs into monstrous financial selfishness. The lasting image is of a man sitting calmly on live television, describing in graphic detail the act of double murder, while genuinely believing, or desperately needing the world to believe, he was acting in service of a higher right.
That is the true self-serving darkness at the heart of the Kraus confession.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material surrounding the Kraus case.
We leave you with one final thought to consider as this complex story moves through the justice system.
Given the incredibly detailed yet legally contested televised confession and the subsequent plea of not guilty, consider this. If a confession is ultimately deemed inadmissible by a court, if a violation of Lorenz Kraus's constitutional rights is found because the interviewer was considered an agent of police, what burden of proof, morally or practically, remains on the prosecution when the truth was already delivered by the perpetrator himself, broadcast live to the entire world?
What happens when the law must technically blind itself to the obvious, publicly known truth in order to uphold the higher integrity of constitutional procedure? That is the complex legal and ethical conflict the court now faces in determining whether to admit the very words that sealed his fate.
Until next time.
Farewell.